First of all, the biggest thing here is that the Supreme Court appears poised to overturn not only a 90-year precedent that shields these these heads of these agencies, but also give President Trump expanded presidential power, giving him the authority to fire these agency heads. Now, this is a really big deal because the Supreme Court does not take overturning precedent very lightly. So a lot of the arguments talked about this precedent. It's something called Humphrey's Executor. It's a case that was decided in 1935, specifically involving the FTC, that shields those agency heads from the president firing them. Now, there was a lot of interesting argument and questioning from the justices. Something that stood out for me with Justice Roberts was that he said that the FTC, as it exists today in 2025, looks very different than it did in 1935 in terms of its executive power and authority. But the liberal justices, those three, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, had some really strong dissent. And I want you to listen very briefly to one of the things that Justice Sotomayor said.
Okay, so what I'm about to tell you is genuinely one of the most devastating financial scandals to hit Donald Trump's presidency. And that's saying something because we've covered countless Trump financial controversies on this channel. But this one is different. This one strikes at the very core of Trump's entire identity, the foundation of everything he's built his political career on. Because for decades, for his entire public life, Trump has sold himself as one thing above all else: a billionaire, a supremely successful businessman, a financial genius who understands money better than anyone, the guy with unlimited resources who can't be bought or corrupted because he already has all the wealth in the world, that image, that persona of the self-made tycoon with the golden touch has been the bedrock of his political appeal. It's why millions of Americans voted for him. It's why they trusted him to run the economy. It's why they believed he'd bring that same business savvy to the White House. But what if that entire image was built on lies? What if the billionaire persona was always more fiction than reality? And what if Donald Trump has been systematically hiding assets, shuffling money through offshore accounts, using shell companies to create an illusion of wealth while actually facing serious financial trouble? Because that's exactly what a New York judge just found. And the ruling that came down is absolutely catastrophic for Trump in ways most people don't fully understand yet. We're talking about a nationwide asset freeze on everything Trump owns. Every bank account, every property, every golf course, every investment, all of it locked down because the court found documented evidence that Trump was actively hiding money while claiming he couldn't afford to pay a massive fraud judgment. Now, before we go any further, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either going to sensationalize this without giving you the real context, or they're going to downplay it because they're afraid of seeming too partisan. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's actually happening with Trump's finances, not just what the networks want you to think is happening, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, breaking down complex financial scandals, connecting the dots between different legal cases, and giving you the tools to understand how power and money really work in this country. Yeah, just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about accountability, about exposing corruption no matter who's involved, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment with your thoughts on whether Trump should face criminal charges for hiding assets. I want to hear what you think about a president who apparently built his entire brand on wealth he may not actually have. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. On November 23rd, a New York judge issued an extraordinary nationwide asset freeze against Donald Trump. And I need you to understand what that actually means, because this isn't just some procedural legal maneuver that doesn't affect anything. A nationwide asset freeze means Trump cannot move money. He cannot transfer assets. He cannot sell properties. He cannot liquidate investments. He cannot use anything he owns as collateral. Everything is frozen solid until this situation is resolved. The court has essentially put a lock on Trump's entire financial empire and told him he can't touch any of it until he comes clean about what he's been hiding. And the reason the judge took this dramatic step is because during the appeals process for Trump's massive civil fraud case, you remember that one where he was found liable for systematically inflating property values to get better loans and insurance rates. During that appeals process, the court discovered something shocking. Trump had been hiding assets. We're talking about bank accounts that were never disclosed in any financial statements. We're talking about offshore holdings in foreign countries that were completely hidden from view. We're talking about shell companies that were set up specifically to shield money from legal proceedings and make it impossible to track who actually owns what. The judge found concrete, documented evidence that Trump was actively trying to conceal his wealth, to move it around, to make it disappear so that he wouldn't have to pay the $355 million in penalties he owes from the fraud case. And folks, this isn't just embarrassing for someone who claims to be a billionaire. This is potentially criminal conduct. This is the kind of asset concealment that can transform a civil case into criminal prosecutions very quickly. When you deliberately hide money from courts during legal proceedings, you're not just being difficult, you're potentially committing fraud and obstruction of justice. The courtroom moment when all of this was revealed was apparently extraordinary. Prosecutors laid out in meticulous detail how Trump had failed to disclose both domestic and foreign bank accounts. They presented evidence of complex financial transactions designed specifically to shield assets from legal liability. They connected the dots between various shell companies and Trump properties like Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago and other family holdings, showing how money was being moved through these corporate structures in ways that obscured true ownership and made it nearly impossible to determine what Trump actually owns. And the judge, looking at all of this evidence, concluded that there was a serious and immediate risk that if the court didn't act right now, the assets would simply disappear. They'd be transferred to offshore accounts beyond the reach of American courts. They'd be moved to family members or business partners through transactions designed to look legitimate. They'd be hidden in such complex layers of corporate structures that collecting on the fraud judgment would become impossible. So the judge did something that almost never happens in American courts, issued a complete nationwide freeze on everything Trump owns, every single bank account, every property, every golf course, every stock portfolio, every piece of real estate, all of it frozen. Trump cannot touch any of it until he fully discloses what he actually has and until the court is satisfied that the assets will be available to pay the judgment he owes. Trump's legal team is absolutely furious about this. They're calling it unprecedented overreach. They're claiming it's politically motivated persecution. They're arguing that freezing a former president's assets sets a dangerous precedent. But here's the thing. The evidence that the judge cited in making this ruling is absolutely damning. This isn't speculation or political innuendo. This is documented proof, actual bank records and corporate filings and financial transactions showing that Trump was systematically hiding money while simultaneously claiming under oath that he couldn't afford to post a $450 million bond to guarantee payment while he appeals the fraud judgment. Think about the audacity of that for a second. Trump's lawyers went into court and said, despite all of his supposed wealth, despite all the properties and businesses and golf courses with his name on them, Trump simply couldn't come up with the money to post bond. They painted this picture of a man who, despite his billionaire image, just didn't have access to that kind of liquid capital. And the whole time, according to what prosecutors discovered, he was hiding hundreds of millions of dollars in accounts he never disclosed. So let's really dig into what happened here, because the details of this case are absolutely wild, and I want to make sure everyone understands the full scope of what's been revealed. To set the stage, we need to go back to the civil fraud case that New York Attorney General Letitia James brought against Trump. This case centered on allegations that Trump and the Trump Organization had systematically inflated the value of properties for years in order to get better terms on loans and lower rates on insurance. We're talking about claiming apartments were 3 times larger than they actually were. We're talking about valuing properties at hundreds of millions more than any legitimate appraisal would support. We're talking about a sustained pattern of financial misrepresentation that went on for decades across the entire Trump business empire. And the court found that Trump did exactly what he was accused of doing. Judge Arthur Engoron ruled that Trump had engaged in persistent and repeated fraud, and he ordered Trump to pay over $355 million in penalties, which, with interest, has grown to well over $400 million. That's a massive judgment. That's the kind of financial penalty that would devastate most people and most businesses. And Trump was also required to post a bond while he appealed the ruling, initially set at $450 million, to guarantee that the money would actually be available if he lost the appeal and the judgment was upheld. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Trump claimed he couldn't post the bond. His lawyers went to multiple courts and said that despite all of Trump's supposed wealth, despite decades of bragging about being a billionaire, despite all the properties and businesses, Trump simply couldn't come up with $450 million in liquid assets or secure a bond from any company willing to guarantee that amount. They said Trump had approached more than 30 different surety companies and been rejected by all of them. They painted this picture of a man who, despite his billionaire image and despite owning properties supposedly worth billions, simply didn't have access to the kind of cash or liquid assets needed to post bond. And at the time, a lot of people were skeptical. How does a supposed billionaire not have access to a few $100 million? But the courts gave Trump some leeway. They reduced the bond amount to $175 million. They allowed him to continue the appeals process with this lower bond requirement. And everyone kind of moved on to the next Trump crisis because there's always another scandal, always another legal problem, always another controversy. But what was happening behind the scenes, what investigators and prosecutors were quietly discovering through subpoenas and financial record analysis, was that Trump's claims of not having money were apparently completely false. He did have money, potentially lots of it. He just wasn't telling anyone about it. He was hiding it in offshore accounts and shell companies and complex corporate structures, specifically designed to make it impossible for courts and creditors to find. The evidence that came out in the November 23rd ruling is genuinely shocking in its scope and detail. Prosecutors presented documentation of bank accounts that Trump never disclosed anywhere in his financial statements or court filings. We're talking about domestic accounts in American banks that simply weren't reported. We're talking about foreign accounts, offshore holdings in countries known for banking secrecy, that were completely hidden from every financial disclosure Trump has ever made. We're talking about shell companies, corporate entities that exist only on paper with no employees and no real business operations, that were being used specifically to hold assets and move money around in ways that obscured who actually owned what. The court found that Trump had been systematically concealing his true wealth while simultaneously going into courtrooms and claiming under penalty of perjury that he was too poor to post bond. Think about the absolutely staggering audacity of that for a moment. Here's a man who has spent his entire adult life, 5 decades, bragging constantly about how rich he is. He literally puts his name in giant gold letters on buildings around the world. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, positioning himself as the ultimate business success story. He ran for president explicitly on the premise that his business acumen and financial success qualified him to run the country better than career politicians. His entire brand, everything that makes Trump Trump, is built on being wealthy beyond imagination, and the whole time, according to these court findings, he was hiding money in shell companies and offshore accounts and lying under oath about what he actually owned. That's not just legally problematic, that's not just financial fraud, that's a fundamental betrayal of everyone who ever believed in the Trump brand or voted for him based on his supposed business genius. The judge's ruling on the asset freeze was extremely explicit about the concerns that led to this extraordinary action. The court stated in clear language that there were serious and well-founded concerns that without an immediate freeze, the assets would disappear offshore or be transferred to family members in ways that would make collection impossible. The judge found concrete evidence that Trump was already in the process of attempting to shield assets from potential collection on the fraud judgment. The court concluded that traditional legal remedies, things like liens or garnishments that normally work in civil cases, would not be sufficient to protect the interests of those who are owed money because Trump had demonstrated both the intent and the capability to hide assets beyond the reach of American courts. And so the judge took the dramatic and highly unusual step of freezing absolutely everything. This is not something courts do lightly. Asset freezes of this magnitude are typically reserved for situations involving drug kingpins or organized crime figures or international fraudsters, cases where there's overwhelming evidence that a defendant will hide or dissipate assets to avoid paying what they owe. The fact that a federal judge found sufficient evidence to justify this kind of comprehensive freeze against a former and current president of the United States tells you just how serious and how well documented the evidence of asset concealment must be. This isn't a judge being overly cautious or politically motivated. This is a judge looking at bank records and corporate documents and financial transactions and saying, we have to stop this person from moving any more money right now before it all disappears into offshore accounts where we'll never find it. The properties and assets that are now frozen include some of the absolute crown jewels of the Trump empire, the flagship properties that have defined his brand for decades. We're talking about Trump Tower, the iconic skyscraper in Manhattan that has been the headquarters of the Trump Organization since it was built. We're talking about Mar-a-Lago, the massive Palm Beach estate that Trump has transformed from a private residence into a combination luxury club and political headquarters. We're talking about Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, and multiple other golf courses around the United States and internationally. And we're talking about hotels and residential properties and commercial real estate holdings. All of it is now frozen solid. Trump cannot sell any of it. He cannot borrow money against it. He cannot transfer ownership to family members or business associates. He cannot use any property as collateral for any new loans or financial arrangements. The assets are completely locked in place until the court is satisfied that Trump has provided full and honest disclosure of everything he owns and until there's no longer any risk of assets disappearing. And for a man who has built his entire identity around his real estate empire, who has defined himself for 5 decades by the properties that bear his name, this is absolutely devastating. It's like someone putting a massive padlock on everything you own and everything you've ever built and telling you that you can't touch any of it, can't do anything with it until you come completely clean about what you've been hiding. For Trump, whose entire sense of self-worth seems tied to his properties and his deals and his ability to move money around, this freeze is probably more psychologically devastating than any of the criminal indictments he's facing. Let me talk specifically about the offshore accounts, because this is really the most damaging and potentially criminal aspect of what was revealed. When we talk about offshore accounts, we're talking about bank accounts held in foreign countries, often in jurisdictions known for strong banking secrecy laws and minimal cooperation with American law enforcement. Now, there are some legitimate reasons why people and businesses have offshore accounts. If you're running a genuine international business, you need foreign bank accounts to conduct operations. If you're doing currency hedging or international investments, offshore accounts can serve legitimate purposes. But there are also deeply illegitimate reasons for offshore accounts: tax evasion, hiding money from the IRS, money laundering, moving proceeds from illegal activities, hiding assets from creditors and courts during legal proceedings. And the way the court described Trump's offshore holdings very strongly suggests they were being used for concealment rather than any legitimate business purpose. These were accounts that were never disclosed anywhere in Trump's financial statements, not to banks. When Uri. He was applying for loans, not to insurance companies, not to courts during legal proceedings. They were connected to shell companies that had no apparent business purpose, no employees, no operations, no reason to exist other than holding money in ways that obscured ownership. They were structured through multiple layers of corporations in different countries, creating intentionally complex arrangements designed to make it as difficult as possible to trace money back to Trump. All of this points to deliberate, calculated efforts to hide wealth, not legitimate international business activity that any normal billionaire might engage in. And if that's what further investigation confirms, if it turns out Trump was using offshore accounts specifically to evade legal obligations and hide money from American courts, that could expose him to serious additional criminal liability on top of all the other legal problems he's already facing. The timing of all this is particularly brutal for Trump because it's landing at a moment when he's already juggling multiple severe legal challenges and desperately needs every financial resource he can access. The civil fraud judgment is still being appealed, and that appeal requires massive amounts of money for legal fees and for the bond. And now Trump's ability to fund that appeal is severely compromised because his assets are frozen and he can't access them. His criminal cases, the ones in New York and Georgia, and the federal cases, all require enormous legal resources, teams of expensive lawyers working full-time, and those legal bills are piling up into the tens of millions of dollars. His political operation, keeping his base engaged, funding rallies and advertising, preparing for whatever political future he envisions, all of that requires constant infusions of cash. And all of that is now in serious jeopardy because a judge has locked down everything Trump owns. This isn't just a legal problem that Trump can fight in court and maybe win eventually. This is an existential threat to Trump's entire operation, both business and political. If Trump can't access his money, he can't pay his armies of lawyers. If he can't pay his lawyers, his legal defenses in multiple cases start to collapse. If his legal defenses collapse, he faces catastrophic outcomes, including potential prison time in some of his criminal cases. It's a cascading series of problems where each one makes the next one worse, and it all stems from this one decision to hide assets rather than disclose them honestly and deal with the fraud judgment directly. And the brutal irony is that if Trump had just been upfront about his finances from the beginning, if he'd disclosed all his accounts and posted the bond and dealt with the fraud case straightforwardly, none of this would be happening. The cover up, as we've seen so many times throughout history, is turning out to be far worse than the original offense. Now, I want to connect this asset freeze scandal to some of the other financial controversies that have been swirling around Trump because this doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger pattern. We've been covering the GAO impoundment audit, where Trump is being investigated for potentially illegally withholding billions of dollars in congressionally appropriated funds, essentially trying to control money that Congress allocated and that he has no legal authority to freeze. We've covered the ongoing questions about how Trump has been funding his various legal defenses and whether campaign contributions that were supposedly for political purposes are being illegally diverted to pay personal legal bills. We've covered the hush money case where Trump received an unconditional discharge, but where the underlying financial improprieties, the falsification of business records to hide payments, were extensively documented. There's a clear pattern emerging across all of these situations. Over and over again, we see Trump engaging in financial maneuvers and schemes that are specifically designed to obscure what's really happening with his money and to avoid transparency. Whether it's inflating property values to get better loans, or hiding assets in offshore accounts during legal proceedings, or impounding congressional funds for his own purposes, or using campaign money for personal legal expenses, the through line is always the same: a person who genuinely believes that the normal rules of financial transparency and legal compliance simply don't apply to him, a person who thinks he's smart enough to game the system and hide what he's doing, a person who has apparently spent decades building elaborate structures of shell companies and offshore accounts specifically to make it impossible for anyone to know what he really owns or what he's really doing with his money. And what this asset freeze ruling demonstrates is that the courts are finally starting to catch up. Judges are finally starting to see through the shell games and the offshore maneuvers and the elaborate corporate structures. They're finally starting to hold Trump accountable for the financial deceptions that have characterized his entire business career and that have now carried over into his political life. Let's talk about the political implications of all this because they're enormous, especially as we move toward the 2026 midterm elections. Trump has always positioned himself fundamentally as a successful businessman, a billionaire who understands money and economics and deal making better than anyone in politics. That image, that brand as the ultimate business success story, has been absolutely central to his political appeal, with voters who believe that his business acumen qualifies him to run the country and manage the economy. But what happens to that carefully cultivated image when court documents reveal that Trump was hiding money in offshore accounts? What happens when voters learn that the supposed billionaire couldn't post the bond because he was systematically concealing his true financial picture from courts? What happens when the guy who promised to drain the swamp and clean up government corruption turns out to be engaged in exactly the kind of financial shenanigans that most people associate with corrupt elites trying to hide their wealth from legal accountability? Democrats are absolutely going to have a field day with this in campaign advertising. They're going to run ads showing clips of Trump bragging about his wealth juxtaposed with court findings about hidden offshore accounts. They're going to talk about shell companies and asset concealment and offshore banking in ways that make Trump sound like a financial criminal rather than a business genius. They're going to ask voters in very direct terms whether they really want to trust the economy and the country to a man who's been caught by federal courts systematically hiding his own money while lying about what he owns. And those attacks are going to be devastatingly effective because the evidence isn't coming from Democratic operatives or partisan opponents. It's coming from federal judges who reviewed financial records and made factual findings about asset concealment. That's the kind of evidence that cuts through partisan spin and really damages a politician's credibility with voters. The impact on Trump's actual ability to function as president, assuming he remains in office through all of this, is also potentially catastrophic. A sitting president with completely frozen assets is in an incredibly compromised and vulnerable position. Trump can't access his wealth to fund legal defenses as new cases and appeals pile up. He can't use his properties as leverage for any new business deals or financial arrangements. He can't make the kind of moves and deals that he's made throughout his entire career, the constant buying and selling and refinancing that has characterized Trump's business operations. He's essentially financially paralyzed at the exact moment when he's facing more legal jeopardy than any president in American history. And that paralysis is going to affect absolutely everything about his presidency, It's going to affect his decision making as he becomes more desperate for money and more willing to cut corners. It's going to affect his mood and his temperament, and we've already seen how Trump reacts when he feels cornered or attacked or like things are spinning out of his control. It's going to affect his relationships with the people around him, the advisors and family members and business partners who all depend on Trump's wealth and largesse for their own positions and livelihoods. The entire Trump operation, both the political side and the business side, fundamentally runs on money, on the constant flow of cash that funds everything from legal fees to campaign operations to the lifestyles of everyone in Trump's orbit. And right now, that money is completely frozen, locked down by court order. The implications and ripple effects of that are going to spread out in ways we probably can't even fully anticipate yet, but they're going to be significant, and they're going to touch every aspect of Trump's presidency and his political future. I want to talk more specifically about what this means for the billionaire image that Trump has so carefully cultivated over 5 decades, because I think this is really the most culturally and politically important aspect of this entire scandal. For 50 years, since the 1970s, when Trump first started getting publicity in New York, he has told everyone who would listen that he's fabulously, incredibly, unimaginably wealthy. He's bragged constantly about his net worth, claiming at various times to be worth anywhere from $5 billion to $10 billion. He's put his name in huge letters on buildings around the world. He's created this persona of the ultimate successful businessman who has so much money that nothing can touch him. He's used that supposed wealth as proof that he's smart and capable and that he can't be corrupted because he already has everything money can buy. But what the court found in this asset freeze case suggests that much of this was always an elaborate illusion. The man who claimed to be worth billions of dollars couldn't come up with a few hundred million to post bond. The man who said he had unlimited resources was desperately hiding money in offshore accounts to avoid paying a court judgment. The man who built his entire brand and political career on being rich was engaging in exactly the kind of desperate financial maneuvering that you'd expect from someone who's actually in serious trouble, someone whose empire is built on debt and leverage and creative accounting rather than genuine wealth. This isn't what real billionaires do. People who actually have billions of dollars in real wealth don't need to hide money in shell companies. They don't need to use offshore accounts to shield assets from courts. They just pay what they owe because they have more than enough to cover any judgment and still live in luxury. The fact that Trump was engaging in these desperate tactics to hide assets suggests very strongly that the real financial picture is much, much worse than he's ever admitted publicly. So here's the bottom line on all of this. What happened in that New York courtroom on November 23rd is a genuinely historic moment in American politics and law. A federal judge found that the former and current president of the United States was systematically hiding assets in offshore accounts and shell companies while claiming under oath that he couldn't afford to pay a massive civil fraud judgment. The judge responded by freezing every single asset Trump owns, every bank account, every property, every investment, everything pending full disclosure of what he actually has and proof that assets won't disappear. This is completely unprecedented. This is absolutely devastating to Trump's brand and image. And this is the kind of finding that would instantly end the political career of literally any normal politician. Whether it ends up having that kind of impact on Trump remains to be seen, because Trump has somehow survived and bounced back from so many scandals and legal problems that would have destroyed anyone else. But the facts are now permanently in the court record. The hidden accounts have been exposed, the offshore holdings are documented, the billionaire image is fundamentally shattered, and Trump is going to have to deal with the consequences of that, both legally and politically, for as long as he remains in public life. This story is far from over, and I'll keep following every development as it unfolds. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss anything, and I'll see you in the next one.